My husband's best friend stepped out of the bathroom holding a bottle of abortion medication and said, "I thought you two were trying to have a baby." I looked up from my laptop, where I had been researching IVF clinics. "We are trying, Ethan." "Then what's this?" he asked, holding up an orange prescription bottle. "Why do you have mifepristone?" "This is medication for abortion." My stomach sank. "That's not mine," I said, laughing nervously. "I would never." "Liam, is this yours?" The silence hung in the air like a heavy weight. Ethan looked back and forth between us, his expression shifting as realization began to settle in. "There's only 2 people living here," I said, as Ethan began to read the prescription label. "It was filled last month, and the month before." My voice trailed off as I whispered, "My miscarriages." "I've had 4 miscarriages in just 23 months, I said, standing up slowly, my legs trembling. "You've been poisoning me? Killing our babies?" Liam stumbled back against the counter, his face going pale. "It's not what you think," he stammered, but I was done. "Then explain this," I snapped, my voice rising. "Why do we have abortion medication in our house when I've been taking fertility supplements, injecting myself with hormones, and blaming my body for failing us?" I could feel my anger building. "You called our children." The words broke through raw and painful. "Your mother called me defective at Thanksgiving, said maybe we should explore other options. Your sister announced her 3rd pregnancy at Christmas, and everyone looked at me like I was broken." I shook my head. I turned down that promotion to reduce stress. I gave up coffee, wine, sushi, even my anxiety medication to increase the chances. Liam opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off. "Don't you dare quote the doctor to me." Ethan stood frozen. "I did 3 rounds of Clomid," I continued, rounds that made me so sick I couldn't even work. I had dye shot through my fallopian tubes. I looked at Liam. "Do you have any idea how much that hurts? While you were poisoning me, I let doctors torture me, all to figure out why I couldn't stay pregnant." Tears streamed down my face as I spoke. "We named our babies, you remember? Oliver, Maya, Lily, Evan. I was knitting their baby blankets while you were making sure they'd never need them." Liam reached out with trembling hands, but I pulled back. Ethan's face turned even paler. "Liam, is this about Grace?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but sharp. Liam's face drained of color. "Who's Grace?" I asked. "She's nobody," he replied quickly. "Just someone from work." Ethan cut him off. "I saw you leaving work together late last month. You were flirting. Her hand was on your neck." Liam's body began to shake. "When I asked you about it, you said it was a work project," I said. "I believed you, because I never thought you were the type to cheat. But now..." Ethan took out his phone, and I grabbed Liam's from the counter. "You said she was nobody, so you won't mind me looking." The text conversation with Grace appeared immediately. Hearts, kiss emojis. "Can't wait until you're finally free." I scrolled up with shaking hands. "Did the insurance pay out yet?" My blood ran cold as I read further. Perfect. Almost enough for the lawyer and apartment deposit. One more should do it. Her next text, she wants to try again next month. Perfect timing. I couldn't keep the tremble out of my voice. "Making our dead babies pay for your future." Liam's knees buckled, his face flushed with embarrassment. He gripped the counter, struggling to stay upright. "You've been collecting money from our dead children?" I could hardly breathe. "Pregnancy loss insurance, through your work." $8,000 per miscarriage, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't even know that existed. $32,000. I kept scrolling, each message worse than the last. "You texted her from the hospital. While I was miscarrying Lily, you wrote, 1 more after this and we're free." "You held my hand through contractions while you were planning the next murder." Liam started to speak, but I couldn't listen. "You didn't mean to hurt me." I screamed. "You always brought home the pregnancy tests," I continued, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. "You knew exactly when I was pregnant so you could start poisoning me. You controlled when each baby would die, so it would never look suspicious." I threw his phone at him. "You let me believe I was broken. You let your mother say I wasn't good enough. And you agreed with her." I backed away, disgusted. "You said you'd love me anyway, like you were doing me a favor." Ethan was already dialing. "I'm calling the police." Liam reached for me, his voice shaking. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I asked, stepping away from him. "How you killed our babies for money. How you poisoned me to afford your girlfriend." I could feel the anger and sadness crash through me as I said, "I used our savings for fertility treatments while you collected death benefits." I looked at the man I thought I knew. "Every night, I prayed for a baby. Every morning, I injected myself with hormones that caused me to gain 30 pounds. And your response? You told me I was less attractive. Do you remember that? While you were secretly poisoning me so you could be with Grace." Liam opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. It was like even he couldn't find a lie big enough to cover what was happening. Meanwhile, Philip was on the phone with the police, giving them our address. "Oliver would be turning 2 by now," I murmured. "Maya would be walking by now. Lily would be 3 months old. But to you, they were nothing but transactions, right? $8,000 each." In the distance, the sound of sirens could be heard. Liam stood there, frozen, unable to speak. I whispered again, "I wanted to be a mother." "And you knew that. You watched me destroy myself, trying and trying," I added as the sirens grew louder. "They're coming for you," I said, my voice barely audible. And I hoped Grace was worth it. I saw Liam's eyes dart nervously around the room. Then, before I could react, he bolted toward the back door. Philip pulled me into his arms as I cried. Suddenly, the front door exploded open, and 3 officers rushed in, their hands on their weapons. Philip released me, and I pointed toward the back door, still swinging off its hinges. 2 officers dashed through the kitchen and out into the yard while the 3rd one stayed with us. My body was shaking uncontrollably, making it hard to stay on my feet. The officer kept asking what happened, but I couldn't get the words out. All I could do was point at the prescription bottle on the counter and sob. Philip picked up Liam's phone from the floor and handed it to the officer. The screen was still showing those horrific texts about turning our dead babies into money. The officer's expression changed from confusion to shock as he read through the messages. He immediately pulled out his radio, requesting evidence bags and a crime scene team. The sirens got louder, and soon paramedics arrived with their equipment. They saw me shaking and crying and immediately began checking my vitals. My blood pressure was dangerously high at 180/110, and my pulse was racing at 140. The paramedic said I needed to go to the emergency room right away. She explained that the poisoning, which had been happening for nearly 2 years, could have caused unseen damage to my organs. Philip said he would drive me and help me stand. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to lean on him just to walk. The officer told me detectives would meet us at the hospital to take my statement. Outside, I noticed 4 police cars with flashing lights, and neighbors were standing on their porches, watching everything unfold. I saw Mrs. Thompson from next door, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. Philip helped me into his car, and we drove to the hospital in silence, except for my occasional sobs. When we arrived at the emergency room, they immediately took me back after Philip explained about the poisoning. The triage nurse's eyes went wide when she heard about the mifepristone. They immediately got me settled into a room, and a doctor arrived within minutes. I told her everything, about the 4 miscarriages, the fertility treatments, and discovering that Liam had been giving me abortion medication. She ordered a full set of tests, blood work, urine tests, liver function tests, and an ultrasound to check for any organ damage. A nurse came in and drew what felt like 20 vials of blood. Then another nurse entered, holding a camera to document me for evidence. She took pictures of my face, my arms where the 4 marks from the miscarriages were still visible, and my swollen belly, a result of the fertility drugs. They told me all of it would be documented for the police report. I could hear Philip out in the waiting room, talking on the phone. Later, he told me he was calling in sick to work and texting our friends about what had happened. He kept saying that he should have said something when he saw Liam with Grace. He looked completely crushed by guilt when I saw him between tests. After about 2 hours, a detective arrived. Detective Aaron Williams was tall with kind eyes, and he introduced himself as the lead investigator. He set up his laptop and began typing as I told him everything. I explained how we had been trying for a baby for almost 2 years. How the 4 miscarriages had destroyed me. How the fertility treatments had drained our entire savings. I told him about finding the prescription bottle today. About the texts involving the insurance money. About Liam running when the police arrived. Detective Williams asked me detailed questions about dates, times, and medical records. He gave me his business card, which had his direct cell phone number on it. He said they would need my consent to search the house thoroughly. I signed the form without hesitation. The detective informed me that they'd be collecting everything from the kitchen, including all medications in the house. He also mentioned they'd already issued an alert for Liam's car and frozen his credit cards and bank accounts. He assured me Liam wouldn't get very far. After the detective left, a social worker entered my room. She was an older woman, her touch gentle as she sat beside me and explained that reproductive coercion was a recognized form of domestic abuse. She handed me pamphlets about emergency protective orders and victim resources, explaining that what Liam had done was not just attempted murder, but fraud and domestic violence, all rolled into one. Right there in the hospital bed, she helped me fill out the paperwork for an emergency restraining order. Later that night, around 9, the doctor returned with my test results. I still couldn't understand how anyone could plan something so horrific. Liam had been timing his medication, basing it on my pregnancy tests. My liver enzymes were elevated from the ongoing poisoning. She said it would take months to fully determine the extent of the damage. She prescribed medication to help my liver heal and gave me referrals to specialists. She emphasized how lucky I was that Philip found that bottle when he did. Another pregnancy with Liam poisoning me could have killed me. They discharged me around 10:30, handing me a stack of papers and follow-up appointment details. Since the police had declared our house a crime scene, Philip drove me to his apartment. I wasn't allowed back for at least 48 hours while they processed the evidence. His apartment was small but tiny. He set me up in his guest room, making sure I had fresh sheets and towels. He prepared chamomile tea and sat with me while I just stared at the wall. It felt like a bad dream, like none of this was real. My phone kept buzzing with messages and calls from people who had heard the news. I couldn't handle any of it. At midnight, I called my boss, knowing I couldn't go to work the next day, and likely not for weeks. She could hear the distress in my voice and immediately understood something awful had happened. I told her it was a family emergency and that I needed time off. She told me to take whatever time I needed and mentioned that HR would send over the paperwork for family medical leave. I hung up and sat on Philip's couch, staring into space, until I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m. When I woke up a few hours later, the first thing that crossed my mind was that this might have all been a terrible nightmare. But when I saw the white hospital bracelet still on my wrist, the truth hit me all over again. I barely made it to the bathroom before I started throwing up. I stayed there, on the cold tile, dry heaving and crying, until there was nothing left. Philip knocked softly on the door and brought me water and a wet washcloth, but I couldn't even look at him because I felt so ashamed of falling apart like this. Around 9 a.m., my phone rang again. When I saw the blocked number, I almost didn't answer. But something inside me made me pick up. The detective's voice was calm and professional as he told me they had found the prescription bottle at the house. He mentioned that they had tracked records showing Liam had been getting refills from 3 different pharmacies, using different doctors. The insurance company had already opened an investigation into the fraud and would likely need to speak to me soon. After hanging up, I remembered I had a fertility appointment scheduled for that afternoon, so I called the clinic to cancel. When I started explaining why I couldn't come in, the nurse grew silent. Then she said she needed to transfer me to someone else. The next person who answered introduced herself from the legal department. She said they were flagging my file and would be providing all my medical records to support the criminal case. She asked if I had already retained a lawyer. I hadn't even considered that yet. By noon, my phone rang again. This time, it was Sophia Blake from my employer's insurance department. Her voice was professional, but I could hear the shock underneath as she asked me for a recorded statement regarding the pregnancy loss claims that had been filed. For the next 40 minutes, I went over each miscarriage in detail, when it happened and how much money had been paid out for each one, while she typed everything up. She kept apologizing, saying things like, "I'm so sorry," and "This is unbelievable," even as she tried to maintain professionalism. After the call, I opened my laptop and began going through our bank statements. I needed to see the proof for myself. The deposits were undeniable, $8,000 showing up in our joint account after each miscarriage, only to be immediately transferred to an account under Liam's name. The dates matched perfectly with each time I lost a baby. I took screenshots of everything, sent them to myself and the detective. My phone rang again, and seeing it was Liam's mother, I almost let it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. She didn't wait for me to speak. Before I could say a word, she started yelling at me, blaming me for ruining her son's life with my lies and hysteria. She raged about how dare I involve the police in something so private. She said I had always been unstable, and this just proved it. She claimed Liam was better off without me. I ended up hanging up, but not before recording the whole conversation on Philip's phone. I forwarded the recording to the detective, then blocked her number, her husband's, and Liam's sister's, knowing they'd be calling soon. The next few days felt like a blur, endless police interviews, phone calls with lawyers, and insurance investigators. Then I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The moment I opened it, I knew it was from Liam. He wrote that this was all a huge misunderstanding and begged me to stop the police before things got worse. He had the nerve to claim the medication was supposed to help me with my miscarriages, not cause them. He even tried to convince me that he had been trying to spare me more pain by ending the pregnancies early when he realized they weren't viable. Reading his lies made me physically ill, and I had to rush to the bathroom. The following day, I had an appointment with a reproductive specialist the detective had recommended to assess the damage. The doctor went through my medical history and explained how repeated exposure to mifepristone could have caused severe damage to my uterus and cervix. She ordered a series of specialized tests and blood work, warning me that my future fertility could be permanently compromised. She mentioned she had seen cases like mine before, but never one where a spouse deliberately poisoned their partner. While I was at the doctor's office, Philip was at the police station, giving his statement about seeing Liam with Sloane. He showed them photos from a restaurant visit last month when Liam had claimed he was at a client dinner. One of the photos clearly showed Sloane's hand on Liam's neck, and they were sitting much too close for comfort. Philip also told them about Liam's lie when he'd been questioned, claiming it was just a work project. That afternoon, the detective called with an update that made everything even worse. The forensics team had tested our coffee maker and discovered mifepristone residue in the water reservoir and filter. They also examined the vitamin supplements Liam had been giving me for stress and found that the pills had been opened and resealed, with the medication mixed in. The detective confirmed this wasn't just a few isolated incidents but deliberate poisoning over an extended period. 3 days later, I was sitting in a waiting room filled with the scent of vanilla candles and old magazines, my hands trembling around a paper cup of water. The therapist's door opened, and a woman with gray hair pulled back into a bun called my name. Hannah Phillips's office was warm, filled with plants and soft chairs that made you sink into them when you sat down. She listened carefully as I told her everything, from discovering the prescription bottle to the coffee maker. When I finished, she leaned in and told me exactly what I needed to hear. She called it attempted murder, not just betrayal. We spent the remainder of the session putting together a safety plan, which included steps like changing my locks and getting a new phone number. My hands stopped shaking when she wrote down the crisis hotline number and made me promise to call if I ever felt unsafe. The next morning, the detective called again and asked me to come to the station. They had retrieved security footage from our home's cloud backup, footage I had forgotten was even there. The timestamps showed Liam coming home with pharmacy bags on January 15th, March 3rd, May 20th, and July 8th, each date exactly 2 days before I lost a baby. The worst part came when I watched him on the kitchen camera, adding white powder to my morning smoothie while I was still in bed. He stirred it carefully, washed the spoon, then brought it to me with a kiss on my forehead. The detective had to pause the video when I started throwing up in their trash can. They gave me ginger ale and crackers while explaining that they had found even more evidence on Liam's devices. He had been using encrypted messaging apps with Sloane, trying to delete everything after I confronted him. Their tech team was working on recovering the messages, but it could take weeks. The detective scribbled every detail in his notebook as I sat there, feeling like my entire life was now evidence. I started looking for apartments that same week because I couldn't stay in that house anymore. Every showing felt like I was watching someone else walk through empty rooms, asking about lease terms. The first apartment was too expensive, the second one overlooked a playground where kids were constantly yelling and laughing. The third had a kitchen that looked just like ours, and I had to leave before the agent even finished talking about the dishwasher. Finally, I found a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery that filled the air with the scent of fresh bread every morning. The landlord didn't ask for a reference from my current address, and I didn't have to explain anything. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the district attorney's office. Thomas Reeves, with his gravelly voice and constant throat clearing, told me they were building 2 cases, one for poisoning and one for insurance fraud. He said the evidence was strong but warned me that the process would take months, possibly longer. They would need me to testify, to face strangers who would judge whether my pain was valid enough for justice. He gave me the number of a victim advocate and told me to reach out if I needed anything. But we both knew what I truly needed was something that could never be returned. The next day, divorce papers arrived. Liam's lawyer claimed I was having a mental breakdown and making false accusations. What kind of person documents their own crimes so thoroughly? The security footage showing Liam adding powder to my smoothies while I slept. Did he forget about the cameras, or did he think he'd never be caught? They wanted control over our finances, claiming I was too unstable to make decisions about money. My hands trembled with anger as I read his claims that I was delusional and had imagined everything because of grief. He even suggested I needed a psychiatric evaluation before any divorce proceedings could continue. The divorce papers felt like a weight in my hands, as if I was holding proof that he was still trying to destroy me, even from jail. That afternoon, I called Nathan Cole after being turned away by 6 other lawyers who said my case was too complicated. He cost more than I made in 3 months, but he promised to fight every lie Liam was spreading. The first thing he did was file for a protective order and freeze our joint accounts before Liam could empty them. Nathan had me write down everything I could remember while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I was finished, he looked over his glasses at me and said, "We're going to bury Liam in court." The following week, I received FMLA paperwork from work. My manager called, her voice careful as if she feared I might break at any moment. She told me to take as much time as I needed, but we both knew the performance review was coming up. The promotion I had turned down to reduce stress now felt like another thing Liam had stolen from me. I filled out the FMLA forms at my new kitchen table, writing, "Family medical emergency," in the reason box, because there wasn't a category for husband murdered my babies. 3 weeks later, while I was grocery shopping, I ran into Sloane at the store. She was buying pregnancy tests. The irony of it all almost made me scream, but instead, I pulled out my phone and began recording. She walked right up to me and had the nerve to touch my arm, saying she had no idea what Liam had been doing. Her voice was saccharine as she insisted they were together but that she thought I already knew about the affair. She claimed Liam told her our marriage was just for show, that we had an arrangement. She kept talking while I filmed, admitting they had been together for 8 months and that Liam promised to leave me after the holidays. When she finally noticed my phone, her face went white and she practically ran to her car. The blood test results came back the next day. The doctor called to tell me they had found traces of mifepristone still in my system 5 weeks after the last poisoning. She said it proved repeated exposure over time, that my body had been saturated with the drug. She added that this documentation would be crucial for the criminal case and asked if I wanted a referral for counseling. I almost laughed because I was already seeing Hannah twice a week, and it still didn't feel like enough to process all of this. 2 weeks passed in a blur of more interviews and medical tests before I received the call. The detective's voice was flat when he told me they had found Liam 3 states away, pulled over for a broken taillight. He had been living in his car, hadn't shaved in days, and broke down in tears when they arrested him. The booking photo they sent me showed a man I could barely recognize. His eyes were hollow, his clothes wrinkled and stained. I stared at the photo for an hour, waiting for some emotion to surface, but I felt nothing but emptiness. Philip kept asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer because I didn't know. The bail hearing took place 3 days later, in a courtroom that smelled of stale coffee and floor cleaner. Liam's mother sat in the front row, dressed in her church clothes, glaring at me with a look that could kill. When the judge set bail at $200,000, she stood up and wrote a check without hesitation. The bailiff later told me she had refinanced her house to pay for it. The judge granted my request for a restraining order, but I knew that piece of paper wouldn't stop Liam if he really wanted to hurt me. Afterward, his mother cornered me in the hallway, hissing that I was ruining her son's life over nothing. I walked away without saying a word because what could I say to someone who thought poisoning babies was nothing? The next week, Hannah suggested I try a pregnancy loss support group that met at the community center on Tuesdays. I sat in that circle of plastic chairs for 20 minutes before I could speak. When I finally said the words aloud about what Liam had done, the room fell silent. One woman started crying, and another reached out to hold my hand. They believed me without hesitation, which was more than I could say for most people. After the meeting, 3 of them gave me their numbers and told me to call anytime. I saved their numbers but couldn't bring myself to reach out yet. 4 days later, while I was grocery shopping, the detective called again. They had gotten Sloane's phone records and found hundreds of texts between her and Liam discussing the insurance money. She had known everything from the start and helped him plan every poisoning. The prosecutor offered her a deal to testify against Liam, and she took it without hesitation. No loyalty among murderers, apparently. I had to leave my card in the cereal aisle and sit in my car for an hour after that call. The next morning, I decided to stop at my usual coffee shop for the first time since everything had happened. There was a pregnant woman ordering at the counter, her hand resting on her rounded belly. The sight of her made my chest tighten, and suddenly, I found it hard to breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in, and my vision darkened at the edges. I stumbled to my car and used the breathing techniques Hannah had taught me. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. It took me 15 minutes before I could steady myself enough to drive home. Later that afternoon, Thomas, my lawyer, called with some news that made me want to scream. Liam was now claiming that the mifepristone had been prescribed to him by a doctor for his own medical condition. He spun a story about a rare disorder that supposedly required the medication, pure nonsense. We spent the next 6 hours combing through all my medical records from the past 3 years. There was no prescription for that drug anywhere in my files. Thomas told me we'd need to subpoena Liam's medical records to prove he was lying. The next day, I received a call from the insurance company, and Elisha's voice was all business. They were denying the 4 claims Liam had filed and demanded repayment of $32,000 plus interest. They also informed me they were filing criminal charges for insurance fraud on top of everything else. She said they took fraud seriously and would pursue it to the fullest extent. Good, I thought. Let him face consequences from every angle. A week later, Philip drove me back to the house so I could pack up my things. I had been staying with him since that first night, and I couldn't put it off any longer. The moment I stepped into the kitchen, my body started shaking uncontrollably. This was the place where he had poisoned me every morning, adding that drug to my smoothies while kissing my forehead. I vomited into the sink, with Philip gently rubbing my back. We gathered clothes and important papers, leaving everything else behind. I couldn't stand being in those rooms, once filled with happiness, now tainted by the truth of what had happened. That night, my phone started buzzing with messages from people I thought were friends. Liam had been posting on social media, claiming I was having a mental breakdown and fabricating horrible lies. Some people believed him and sent me messages, telling me I needed help. Others just wanted the details, treating my pain like it was some form of entertainment. I deleted all of my social media accounts after seeing one post that said I was clearly lying because no husband would do something so evil. The following week, the prosecutor brought in a forensic toxicologist to review my case. She spent hours explaining how the pattern of poisoning showed careful planning. Each dose was timed to end the pregnancy while keeping me alive, requiring specific medical knowledge. The spacing between the poisonings was meant to mimic natural miscarriages. She said whoever did this knew exactly how to make it look like bad luck. The prosecutor recorded everything for the trial. 2 weeks later, I was loading boxes into the back of Philip's truck, rain soaking through my jacket. The apartment I had found was across town, in a building that smelled of old carpet and had water stains on the ceiling. Philip carried my couch up 3 flights of stairs without a single complaint, despite his face turning red with the effort. We worked mostly in silence, as every time Philip tried to speak, his voice would crack and he'd look away. When we finally assembled the bed frame, he sat down on the floor and stared at his hands. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Finally, he told me he should have said something when he saw Liam with Grace. I assured him it wasn't his fault, but he shook his head, calling himself a coward. After that, we set some rules about how often he could check in on me, because his guilt was causing him to text me every hour. The next morning, Thomas called again to tell me that Liam's lawyer wanted to meet about a plea deal. I drove to Thomas's office, which was lined with law degrees and photos of him shaking hands with important-looking people. Liam's lawyer sat across from us with a folder full of papers, offering a deal that would reduce the charges if I agreed not to sue for damages. Thomas listened quietly before leaning back in his chair and telling the lawyer that the evidence was too strong to even consider any deals. The lawyer kept pushing, suggesting Liam would plead to simple assault instead of poisoning. Thomas actually laughed and said the grand jury would never accept that. 3 days after that meeting, I found myself at the divorce mediation in a conference room overlooking the city. Liam sat at the other end of the table, looking thinner than before, with dark circles under his eyes. His lawyer started reading from prepared notes about dividing the marriage assets. Then the lawyer said, since I made more money than Liam, I should pay him support. My lawyer, Nathan, jumped up so fast that his chair hit the wall. Now that was a lawyer who knew how to show real anger. How could anyone suggest the victim should pay the person who poisoned them, he asked. He pulled out our tax returns to show that I had only made more money in the last 2 years, while Liam had been the higher earner for 5 years before that. Nathan also pointed out that Liam had been stealing from me through insurance fraud, making any claim for support absurd. Liam's lawyer tried to argue, but Nathan quickly shut him down with case law and precedents until they finally dropped the request for support. The following Monday, I returned to work, but only for half days. I couldn't concentrate on anything and kept making mistakes on reports I'd done 100 times before. My supervisor found me crying in the bathroom after I sent an email to the wrong client. She told me to take my time and assured me that everyone understood what I was going through. But deep down, I knew my career was as good as over. I couldn't focus long enough to do even the simplest tasks. My hands trembled when I tried to type, and I kept losing track of what I was doing halfway through projects. A week later, Thomas called with news that made me want to scream. Sloane had struck a deal with the prosecution. She had handed over everything, including texts where Liam referred to the babies as financial opportunities and calculated how much money each one would bring in. She showed them messages where he meticulously planned when to administer the medication based on my cycle. There were also emails discussing apartment listings and how they'd use the insurance money for deposits and furniture. Sloane even had recordings of phone calls where Liam laughed about how I blamed myself for the miscarriages. Thomas said her testimony was devastating and would almost certainly guarantee a conviction. But the worst day came when I had to go to the prosecutor's office to identify the evidence. They brought out clear plastic bags containing the baby blankets I had been knitting. The yellow one for Oliver still had the needles in it from when I had stopped mid-row. The green one for Maya was nearly finished except for the border. The purple one for Lily had only a few inches done. The blue one for Evan was complete, and I remembered wrapping it in tissue paper, hoping that maybe this time we'd actually get to use it. The prosecutor asked me to confirm they were mine, and I could barely manage a whisper of agreement. They also showed me the pregnancy journals I had kept, documenting symptoms and my hopes for each baby. Seeing everything labeled as evidence, with case numbers assigned, hit me hard. It made me realize that these babies would never be anything more than pieces of evidence in a criminal trial. 2 weeks later, the grand jury met, and Thomas called me that afternoon to tell me they had indicted Liam on all charges. He was facing poisoning with assault, insurance fraud, and domestic violence charges, which could mean 20 years in prison. Thomas said this was one of the strongest cases he had ever seen, thanks to all the evidence and Sloane's testimony. But he warned me that trials were unpredictable and Liam's lawyer would do anything to cast doubt. He said we needed to prepare for a long, hard fight and that Liam might still try to take a plea deal as the trial approached. The next week, I went to see my fertility doctor, who ran a variety of tests to assess the damage. She came back with mixed results, some scarring but not complete infertility. She said I might still have the chance to have children but recommended waiting at least a year to let my body heal. She also mentioned that the emotional trauma would take time to process before I could think about trying again. I left her office feeling numb, unsure if I would ever want to try again after everything I had been through. While dealing with all the legal chaos, I started receiving mail I didn't recognize. Credit card statements for cards I had never opened, with balances totaling thousands of dollars. I called the companies, and they said the cards were in my name, linked to my social security number. The charges were for jewelry, electronics, and cash advances, totaling $30,000. I took everything to Nathan, who filed the necessary fraud paperwork but warned me it would take months to resolve, and I might have to pay some of it while we fought. He uncovered applications Liam had forged using my signature and submitted proof to the credit companies, but they were moving slowly. Then, one morning, I arrived at work to find a massive flower arrangement on my desk, accompanied by a note in Liam's handwriting, begging for forgiveness. Security footage showed the delivery person, but not who had ordered them. I called the police to report the restraining order violation, but they said without proof Liam had ordered them, they could only issue a warning. Security escorted me to my car after work, telling me they'd be watching for any further deliveries. The flowers went straight into the dumpster, but I could still smell them on my hands even after washing them 5 times. 6 months crawled by, and I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, lighting 4 small candles on what would have been Lily's first birthday. The scent of vanilla filled the living room as I sat on the floor, naming each flame for Oliver, Maya, Lily, and Evan. My hands shook as I lit the last candle, but I managed to get through singing Happy Birthday without completely falling apart. The cake I had bought sat untouched on the coffee table, next to 4 tiny wrapped boxes containing baby socks I couldn't resist buying. I blew out each candle one by one, whispering their names into the smoke. 2 weeks later, the divorce papers came through, and my lawyer explained how Liam's criminal actions meant our prenup was now in full effect. I got the house, both cars, our savings, and the retirement accounts, while he was left with over $40,000 in legal fees and nothing else. The paperwork showed his signature shaky and uneven, as though he'd signed it from county jail. I signed mine firmly and clearly before going home and changing the locks, even though he couldn't get out anyway. 3 months later, I sat in a cold courthouse room, waiting to testify before the grand jury. They made me go over each miscarriage in detail while Liam sat 20 feet away in his orange jumpsuit, watching me. His lawyer kept interrupting, trying to make me doubt my own memories, asking if I was sure about the dates and times. I pulled out my journal where I'd written everything down and read the entries word for word, about the cramping, the bleeding, the emergency room visits, and the DNC procedures. When his lawyer asked if maybe the miscarriages were natural, I pointed to the prescription bottle evidence and asked him to explain why abortion medication was mixed into my prenatal vitamins. The grand jury indicted on all charges within an hour. Hannah met me at her office the next week to help me write my victim impact statement for sentencing. She had tissues ready and a recorder so I could speak when my hands got too shaky to write. I spoke their names and described the nursery I'd envisioned 4 different times. I told them about the baby clothes I had stashed in the closet, still too painful to donate. I mentioned the stretch marks on my stomach, evidence of pregnancies that were real, despite Liam's attempts to erase them. We practiced reading it together until I could get through without my voice breaking completely. A month later, the news about the plea deal came through Thomas's office, and I threw my phone across the room when I heard the terms, 5 years with possible parole after 3. Thomas explained, speaking on speakerphone, that it was actually a favorable outcome for a poisoning case, where technically, the victims never took a breath, according to the law. I screamed that they were real babies to me, then hung up on him. 2 weeks later, the sentencing hearing was held in a packed courtroom. I read my statement while Liam's mother sobbed dramatically in the gallery, and his sister glared at me with cold eyes. The judge nodded, acknowledging my pain, but said he had to follow the plea agreement that had been accepted by the prosecution. Liam stood up and muttered something about being sorry, but the judge cut him off and told him to save it. I walked out, feeling hollow, as his family yelled that I had ruined his life. My lawyer filed the civil suit for emotional distress and battery the same week, cautioning me it could take years to resolve, and I'd probably never see any compensation. I signed the papers anyway, wanting it on record forever what he had done. The insurance company moved faster with their lawsuit, winning $50,000, including penalties and interest, which Liam would owe once he got out. Their lawyer called it a slam-dunk case of insurance fraud and assured me they would garnish any wages he ever earned. It was a small comfort, though, as my arms stayed empty every night. 6 months into his sentence, I began volunteering with a domestic violence group, sharing my story with women who nodded in recognition. Some had visible bruises, while others bore invisible scars, like mine, from partners who found twisted ways to control and hurt them. The coordinator told me that reproductive coercion was more common than most realized and that my story helped others spot the signs. One woman came up to me afterward, crying because her husband had been tampering with her birth control, and she thought she was going insane. A full year after that first moment with Philip holding the prescription bottle, I sat in Hannah's office for our monthly session. My panic attacks had gone from happening every day to about once a week, usually triggered by baby commercials or pregnancy announcements on social media. I had gone back to work full-time and even accepted the promotion I'd turned down before, throwing myself into 12-hour days to keep my mind occupied. My coworkers had stopped walking on eggshells around me, and I could make it through most days without locking myself in the bathroom to cry. The grocery store baby aisle still made me leave my cart and run for the parking lot sometimes, but Hannah said that was normal, and it might never fully go away. I had started dating again, but just casual coffee meetings that never led anywhere. Eventually, I'd have to explain why I flinched when they mentioned wanting kids someday. How does someone document their own evil like that? Those texts where Liam referred to our babies as financial opportunities. I wonder if he typed those words without a second thought, just crunching numbers, while she was dreaming of holding them. The grief hadn't shrunk, but I had gotten better at carrying it, like a heavy backpack that I had learned to balance while navigating each day. Philip started coming over on Thursdays to watch basketball, and we'd order Chinese food. He stopped trying to fix everything or apologize every 5 minutes like he had during those first few months. He set clear rules for himself, texting before coming over, not staying past 10, and not bringing up Liam unless I did first. It helped us find a rhythm that felt almost normal again. Then, one afternoon, the prison called while I was sorting through medical bills. The voice on the other end told me that Liam had been attacked by another inmate and was in the infirmary with broken ribs and a fractured jaw. I hung up without asking if he was okay and went back to my papers, waiting for any feeling to surface. But all I felt was an empty space where caring used to be. The next week, my boss pulled me aside and offered me a transfer to the marketing department in the East Building, away from people who knew my story. It meant I wouldn't have to see the break room where Grace used to eat lunch or walk past Liam's old office every day. I packed up my desk on Friday and moved it to a cubicle with a view of the parking lot, instead of the courtyard where we used to eat lunch together. Hannah convinced me to meet someone for coffee, just coffee, she said, with a guy from her book club who knew my situation but still wanted to meet. I lasted 20 minutes before I made up an excuse about a work emergency because his cologne reminded me of the aftershave Liam wore at our wedding. I had to run to the restaurant bathroom to throw up before driving home. The lawyer called while I was planting tomatoes in my new garden bed, telling me that the civil suit had settled for $75,000, money I would likely never see, but at least there was a legal document saying Liam could never contact me again, even after prison. I bought 4 small trees from the nursery and planted them along the back fence, one for each baby. I wrote their names on river rocks and placed them at the base of each trunk. Oliver got the apple tree because we talked about picking apples with our kids someday. Maya got the oak for strength. Lily got the cherry tree for beauty, and Evan got the maple because fall was when we tried the hardest for him. I watered them every morning before work, pulled weeds on weekends, and sometimes sat on the grass between them, reading pregnancy loss books that Hannah brought me. A reporter from the state paper left 3 voicemails, wanting to feature a story on reproductive coercion and insurance fraud. But I deleted them without calling back because I didn't want to be the cautionary tale in someone's Sunday morning coffee reading. The anniversary came on a Tuesday, and I took the day off to sit in my garden with the trees, which were starting to show new growth. That's when I realized I'd survived something that should have broken me completely. I wasn't grateful for the strength I never asked for, and I wasn't proud of surviving something that never should have happened. But I was still here. Still breathing. Still getting up every morning to water 4 trees, go to work, and sometimes even laugh at Philip's terrible basketball jokes. The poison Liam had fed me for 2 years hadn't killed me, even though it killed our babies. Some days, that felt like its own kind of victory, even though it was a victory I never wanted to win.